Gracias. Me llamo Derek y trabajo en ProPublica, una organización de noticias de investigación sin fines de lucro. Mi español es limitado, pero me siento honrado de estar aquí contigo. Y ahora inglés, ¿no? So my apologies for butchering most of the language. It's been 30 years since I've actively studied Spanish, and actively is a broad, I use that word broadly. I'd like to talk to you today about elections, because I love elections, and I love politics, and even as strange as that seems, in the United States, I still love politics, and I still love elections. I should say, though, at the outset that American elections are, and you may not have heard this before, but they are strange. But they are strange in lots of different ways, and not just in the ways that you see, but hopefully the lessons that I'm going to talk about today can be applied to your situations in elections, whether it's in Argentina in a month or so or elsewhere. So, political data, like I said, is basically my life. Enjoy is not an adequate word. I obsess over them. So, for example, we at ProPublica, I build a database of our federal legislators, our Congress, and their activity, based on their activity. The goal is to tell people what they need to know about the people who represent them and how they do their jobs. And so that's represent, and that part of what we do there. But no, I mean that I love political data. On the left, I've got an example of campaign finance filings, where money, private donations to campaigns, that updates every 15 minutes, because that's how often I want to look at this stuff. And then on the right, we have another site that tracks deleted tweets from our president and lots of other folks. These are not new things, but these are sort of all part of our collections of data. But for most journalists, elections mean election nights, like when the results come in. And my friend and colleague Jeremy Bowers puts it well, so to say the election night is sort of like a competitive rocket launch, which is true. I've worked in elections newsrooms in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and it's really one of the most exciting nights that we can have as journalists and as developers. But it's not everything. And in fact, what I've learned is that our focus is too often on election night, when it should be on all of the things happening prior to election night. I'm not arguing that we ignore the results and ignore election night, but prior to the election is what I think really deserves our more and fuller attention. Because elections, after all, they're about lots of things. They're about primarily voters, they're about candidates, they're about the messages, the themes, the polling, the results. They're not about newsroom competition. Who has the first results and who has the latest results aren't, in the big picture, important aspects of elections. We too often in newsrooms, we prioritize newsroom competition over all these other things. Because elections are complicated affairs, at least in the United States, they're very complicated affairs. Because first we have to schedule the election, and then we have to figure out who can vote in the election. We don't have mandatory voting in the United States. We have sort of optional voting, if you will. And we have to figure out who can vote. And sometimes that changes depending on how old you are and when you turned 18, or when if you moved, you have to register again. Things like this. We have to figure out where people are going to vote, because that's not a set thing in the United States. Where people vote can change, and it can change from one election to another. It can even change within a year from a primary to a general election. Then you actually have to begin voting, and then you have to count the results and publish the results. In most newsrooms, too much of the focus is on publishing the results, which is important, I get that. But it's not everything. If I had my way, I suppose, the first four of these are the really important steps, the crucial steps in understanding an election and telling readers and listeners and viewers what an election is about and how it went. So with this in mind, in 2016, ProPublica created a project called Electionland, which we decided we would cover everything up until the moment the results were announced. So everything starting from months in advance up until, and we'd work through Election Day, and we would care about everything but the results. The goal of it was to document as best we could, nationally and in real time, voting impediments, whether or not people had to wait in long lines, whether or not people couldn't find a polling place, whether or not people had to use what we call a provisional ballot, which is what you use in the United States if you can't find your registration, for example. It's a weird concept in a lot of other places, but we have them. We also wanted to cover ballot design problems, whether or not people could understand the ballot at all. And obviously, increasingly, we have to study and examine and report on issues involving hacking and penetration of election systems. And so to do that, we tried to figure out how could we figure out in a nation of 340 million people how things were going on Election Day. And so what we wanted to do was cast as wide a net as possible by inviting people to text us, to WhatsApp us, to contact us in any way to tell us how things were going for them. But that's not all we did. We tried to build a system for figuring out how all these processes were going. So months before the election, we would gather the data that we need. And data is a huge part of not only what I do at ProPublica, but what we do in the entire organization of ProPublica does, and particularly with regard to elections. So some of the data we gathered we needed maps. We needed to know where polling locations were located. We needed to know where voters were located. And luckily, we have mostly public data on that in the United States. In fact, in many places, gives us a list of voters with their phone numbers and email addresses in some states, which is nice to have. But the most important thing that we did was to build infrastructure, to build software that allows us to collect information about the voting experience, about what it was like to go to register, what it was like to go to vote. And that infrastructure, the public never sees that infrastructure. Our readers and viewers never see that infrastructure, but this process can't work without it. Because what we need to do is we need to collect data from multiple different inputs, multiple different types of information, things that I never considered to be even data years ago. When I started out, data in journalism was you sit at a computer, you ask someone for data, they send you a spreadsheet. Yay, data. But data is so much more than that. And now we have to be able to receive, process, and act on information, whether it comes to us as audio, whether it comes to us as video, whether it comes to us over social media, whether it comes to us as a text message. And so what we're doing is we're building infrastructure. We're building plumbing, really. But the plumbing, as you know, if you rent or own a home, plumbing is important. Plumbing is crucial. When plumbing doesn't work, people get upset, and rightfully so. So after we built the plumbing, we had to build sort of internal dashboards, custom dashboards, so that we could figure out how things were going. Like I said, so we could figure out what was worth our attention and what wasn't. Because while we were very liberal in what we accepted in terms of messages from or input from voters, we had to have a process for figuring out these are the important things, and these are the things that we're going to pay attention to. And lastly, and I can't overestimate this, we didn't do this alone. ProPublica is fewer than 100 people. But for the Electionland, we built a network of other news organizations that amounted to between 400 and 500 journalists who we would get information from voters about problems that they were having and then send them that information back out to other news organizations in their local areas who could report those stories better than we could sitting in a newsroom in New York. And so we went to people and simply said, hey, would you like to be a part of this process? What you get is you get free information about how voting is going in your location, in your state, in your county, in your city. And surprisingly enough, people like getting free stuff, right? But the journalists who worked with us were mostly some smaller newsrooms. Because larger newsrooms, and I know this really well, being a former employee at the Washington Post and the New York Times, is larger newsrooms believe we can do all this stuff by ourselves. I don't think that's true, but I understand the notion when you have a huge newsroom of hundreds or 1,000 people. Most of our partners were small newsrooms, and they needed the help. So we also built some public-facing tools that people, voters and reporters, could use. One of them was called How Well Are Your Elections Run? And it's based on a survey that the government does of the people who run elections locally in the United States. So they go to them and they basically say, tell us all these things about how many people were registered to vote, how many people actually came out and voted, whether or not they registered by mail, whether or not they registered when they got a driver's license, what types of machines you use to process the votes, all those sorts of things. There's a survey that goes out after every election. And so we were able to take the data from that and in every county in the United States, basically try to provide a baseline for reporters and for citizens for understanding how well elections go in your area. Do people turn out? Because low turnout is a problem in a lot of places, and it has a lot of different reasons or possible causes. When they do turn out, do they have trouble voting? Things like that would help reporters understand maybe how to cover their election in a little bit more detail before they get to the results. What we learned is if you have great data, you have to find ways to share it. And this seems a little obvious, but I've been in many newsrooms who collect great information and then keep it for themselves, or only share a little tip of the iceberg, a little part of it. If you have great data that would help people understand how the democratic process is going, I think it's imperative for us as journalists to actually make that available to readers. We have to lower the barriers to communication in what the reporting process looks like. And so the reporting process is almost always, or has been always, reporter initiated. I will go and ask questions. I will go and seek information. And that's a good way to do things. But we now have the ability to just get information from everywhere, right? I mean, you get the amount of information these generate, and then you can send to other people is pretty remarkable. And we have to be able to make use of that. And so we have to be liberal in what we accept, and then have a process for dealing with that information to separate useful information from misinformation. We should look to build on existing efforts. We should not reinvent the wheel here. If there are other projects or other pieces of software that do this job well, we should use them. And as a nonprofit, it kind of is in our interest not to sort of reinvent things, but to use good tools that already exist. And we have to think about building generic infrastructure, because elections are weird, but they're not the only time when we do things as a nation or as a county or as a city. Like, there are a lot of collective things that we do. And in order to track those, in order to monitor those, in order to assess the health of those, we really need generic infrastructure that makes that possible. And so there's some resources I can point you to. You can check out. Folks did a case study of our 2016 Electionland efforts. We also did this again in 2018, and we're going to do it again next year in the United States. But at ProPublica, we're building open source tools to enable newsroom collaboration. And we're going to release these tools so that you can use them, and you can find them on our GitHub, and I'll show you the link for that shortly. We've also this year, and I'm really proud of this, released a guide to doing collaborative data journalism. And this is for newsrooms who want to enter into this space or who are already in here but are not really sure that they have their plans set or their processes in place. And this document is based on the lessons, the things that we have learned in doing Electionland for two different elections, but also in our other data collection efforts as a newsroom. And I also want to point out there's a really, really cool organization called the National Democratic Institute in the United States that does sort of civic work. It's aligned with the National Democratic Party in the United States. There's a Republican equivalent to it as well. But the folks at the NDI actually also build tools for covering elections in what I would call low technology areas. So, for example, they use these tools when they monitor elections in Africa and in Asia and other parts of the world where sometimes the SMS and cell phone is all they have to do that monitoring. And they have thought a lot about how to do this in places where it's hard to do. And they've released software and multiple tools to do this. What's next for us at ProPublica, building on this, because we want to eat our own dog food here, we want to use the tools that we create to do different things, is a project that we've started called Documenting Hate. Because in the United States, there is no national organization or no governmental body that tracks hate crimes. And so we've embarked on an effort to sort of figure out, to answer the basic question of how many hate crimes occur in the United States? How many should we expect to occur? How would we know when there are more or fewer? Really, really fundamental questions of journalism. And so Documenting Hate, this project uses the same basic approach that we did for Electionland and some of the same technology. And this is what we would love to see. We would love to see newsrooms apply our methods, improve them where they can be, to all different kinds of collaborative journalism projects, especially those that involve collecting data. So, and if you're interested more about this, I have a workshop this afternoon that will talk about sort of what that data collection effort might look like and that process might look like for elections, and hopefully it's not as US specific as it was when I have done it in the United States. So, muchas gracias for your time.